Joshua and Israel have an intimidating task ahead of them. That's what we saw when we started the book of Joshua last week. But the Lord spoke encouragement to him so that they then could all share it together. And to go along with that now, what we're going to be looking at today is God giving them a few more boosts for that, while also giving us a glimpse of how expansive the Lord's vision is here, because it's ultimately about more than just Israel. It's what the Lord is saying to the entire world, that He is powerful and terrifying, but He's willing to welcome those who turn to Him. So in knowing His power, we ought to then serve Him without fear for any of the world's threats. This is what's shown to us through the story of Rahab, which is what we're going to be looking at today, and that comes to us from Joshua chapter 2. So hopefully you saw that in your handouts. You already opened up your Bibles there. But if not, now's your chance to go ahead and make your way for Joshua chapter 2, or to grab one of the Bibles that we provide over on the counter if you want to use that, or pull out your phone. Joshua chapter 2, where we're starting with verse 1. It says that Joshua, the son of Nun, sent out 2 men from Acacia Grove to spy secretly, saying, "Go, view the land, especially Jericho." So they went and came to the house of a harlot named Rahab and lodged there. And it was told the king of Jericho, saying, "Behold, men have come here tonight from the children of Israel to search out the country." So the king of Jericho sent to Rahab, saying, "Bring out the men who have come to you, who have entered your house, for they have come to search out all the country." Then the woman took the 2 men and hid them. So she said, "Yes, the men came to me, but I did not know where they were from. And it happened, as the gate was being shut when it was dark, that the men went out. And where the men went, I don't know. Pursue them quickly, for you may overtake them." But she had brought them up to the roof and hidden them with the stalks of flax which she had laid in order on the roof. Then the men pursued them by the road to the Jordan, to the fords. And as soon as those who pursued them had gone out, they shut the gate. So Joshua decides to launch a spy mission, to go and look at the land, which was a risky decision on the basis of, remember what we saw in the book of Numbers, what we talked about again last week, was that when Moses tried this, it resulted in disaster. Not because of Moses, but because the spies he sent, they all came back with a bad report that frightened the rest of Israel so much that nobody was willing to go into the promised land. And then after they refused, God said, "Well, then you're never getting in." And they lost 40 years and an entire generation in the wilderness, in the desert. So this is him potentially inviting the same situation. Maybe they're going to come back with a similar report. But in order to change things up a little bit, he does just tell them to really focus on Jericho. That's the area right across the river from where they are. And so he's saying, okay, we're not going to check out all the potential problems we could have. Let's just do one at a time. And intelligence is really vital to war, so they need to have this information. And the last element is that this is just an opportunity for this second generation to show their quality, to show that they are better, more faithful than their fathers had been. And so they can go in and hopefully complete this mission that their immediate ancestors had not. And so that is what they go to do. But in spite of that need for intelligence, the spies don't actually put any on display here. Not a very good job that they do. They probably expected, yes, that foreign visitors to a prostitute would go undetected. That seemed to be the idea. But they must not have been inconspicuous in their speech or in their behavior, because they're immediately noticed and reported. Fortunately for them, the people of Jericho don't show any intelligence here either. They're easily misled by Rahab. And they don't even search the place anyway, just to be sure. And they immediately run off on the wild goose chase that she sends them on. So she's the only human in this story who comes off in a good light. And that's saying something, because she's a prostitute, a liar, and a traitor. But that's the case that we have here. And we want to take those things in turn. First of all, it is mentioned that she's a harlot, that she's a prostitute. And so that's kind of the most important trait that's put forward about her character, is this sin that she is constantly living in. And that is pretty much a constant where she comes up in Scripture, is that she's described for having lived this lifestyle. And so that's something that's being held against her, but also showing the transformation that's possible for a person like her. And another thing that I do think is at least worth pointing out, this isn't an excuse, but it is at least provides maybe a little bit of an explanation, is that there's nowhere in this story that suggests that she has a husband. And eventually her father is going to be brought up, but still, it seems like Rahab is providing for the entire family, that she's having, for whatever reason, to serve as the head of the household. And so that suggests that the work that she was doing was maybe also the result of desperation, not just of desire. But still, again, that's held up for blame, something that's wrong with what she's doing. The lie is a different case. It's usually the element of the greatest interest when people come to her story is, why did she lie, and was it sinful for her to do that? Every commentary that I read said that it was, that she shouldn't have done this, that there must have been some type of alternative to the way that she behaved. I'm not inclined to agree with that. I think that that actually betrays an attitude that comes from the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment was a period of philosophical inquiry from basically the 17th into the 19th century. And one of the philosophers of that time, his name was Immanuel Kant, and he came up with this idea known as the categorical imperative. So a fancy phrase, what that means in this context is that it's never morally acceptable to lie. It is always imperative, it is always required to tell the truth. And so I think that has influenced the way that people approach this passage when the Bible doesn't really make it quite that clear cut. And where Rahab is discussed, what she does here, she's praised for it. You have James chapter 2, verse 25. It says, likewise, was not Rahab the harlot also justified by works when she received the messengers and sent them out another way? Hebrews 11, verse 31. By faith, the harlot, Rahab, did not perish with those who did not believe when she had received the spies with peace. So both of them, again, they point out her prostitution, but they don't even mention the lie. They see no need to, no reason to. It's not even something that they care to defend because it's just how she accomplished what she accomplished. It was necessary and it was good for her to do. And so when it comes to our situation and trying to figure out, well, how do we square this particular circle? It's by remembering what sin actually is. Every sin, what it boils down to is pride. It's selfishness. That is what leads to the problem. That's what leads to judgment. What she does here by not telling the truth is not selfish. It's actually selfless. She was doing it to protect other people at risk to herself. She could have actually been endangered by doing this. But the truth in this particular case would have been the evil. And so this is something that I think that we can understand by putting it in a slightly more modern context, that we can run into some trouble here because there's something called Godwin's law, and it's this idea that any argument on the internet will eventually devolve into people accusing others of being Nazis. And that's, if you spend time online, that is pretty much what you're going to find. But the Nazis were historical people, okay? They did actual things. We can, on occasion, make comparisons, and this is a point where we can do that. And to try to think about being in the situation of those days, during the Holocaust, and say that you're trying to protect a group of Jewish people and you had them in your home and the Gestapo showed up at your door and asked what you were doing, the categorical imperative would be to say, oh, you caught me, they're up in the attic, let me show you the way. That would be the horrible evil in a case like this. And that's the point to remember. Rahab wasn't the one who was sinning here. It was the people who were looking for God's warriors. They were the ones who were at fault. They were the ones that the Lord was coming to judge, to take their land from them because they were not worthy of it. That's where the problem actually lies here. But I do think another reason why the commentators are usually like, you can't lie and don't ever lie, and why they kind of go for this approach on this is because there is, of course, an opposite danger. Is that if we try to rationalize Rahab's lie here, then it might just be so that we can do that with ours, for self-justification, to be able to say, well, it wasn't really a lie, I had to do this in order for this, that, or the other thing, and so we can eventually just kind of run away with doing things just to actually lie selfishly, to get advantages for not telling the truth for ourselves. And we don't want to do that because that actually is sinful. That is wrong. So basically, what it boils down to is don't lie unless you're talking about saving somebody else's life. There's a higher order of good that's going on here, but a lie in general is still wrong to tell. It is in this case, this particular case, and in cases like it, that we can try to look at the deception for the good that it accomplished. It doesn't mean we can just say whatever we want to. And then the last element of her character that's on display here, like I said, is the one that basically gets no attention at all, but it's that she is a traitor. She does commit treason. And that's another thing, if we're going to talk about an imperative, she's a citizen of this town. She's a member of this people. She should have been on their side. She should have been loyal to them, if you're going to talk just kind of a basic, broad statement. But instead, she helped their enemies. And of course, none of us looks at that as being a problem because of the perspective that we're coming at it from. But in her own time and day, it would have been seen as wrong, and it would have been seen, of course, as incredibly dangerous. It took a great deal of courage, really, to do what she did, considering what would have happened to her if she had been caught. But she did it anyway. So the question is, why? The answer is what we find in the next section, Joshua chapter 2, starting in verse 8. It says that before they lay down, she came up to them on the roof and said to the men, I know that the Lord has given you the land, that the terror of you has fallen on us, and that all the inhabitants of the land are faint-hearted because of you. For we have heard how the Lord dried up the water of the Red Sea for you when you came out of Egypt, and what you did to the 2 kings of the Amorites who were on the other side of the Jordan, Sihon and Og, whom you utterly destroyed. And as soon as we heard these things, our hearts melted. Neither did there remain any more courage in anyone because of you. For the Lord your God, He is God, in heaven above and on earth beneath. Now therefore I beg you, swear to me by the Lord, since I have shown you kindness, that you also will show kindness to my father's house, and give me a true token, and spare my father, my mother, my brothers, my sisters, and all that they have, and deliver our lives from death. So the men answered her, Our lives for yours, if none of you tell this business of ours, and it shall be, when the Lord has given us the land, that we will deal kindly and truly with you. So yes, when Rahab lied and committed that treason, she had to have been frightened about the king's men, but she was more frightened of the Lord. That was what was really driving her here. The word had gone out of the things that he had done for Israel, and she knew her people did not stand a chance, so she picked the winning side. That is what this shows. But that's not sheer self-interest. It's not only that she did this in order to be protected. It's because she recognized and embraced the vital truth that she says here, which is that Yahweh is God. There is an interesting comparison that you can make between ancient paganism and modern relativism, the modern worldview that we see in secular culture. At a few different points, but one of the most important is the idea that every option is good as long as it's meaningful to you. And so that's what relativism really means, is that truth is relative, that there is no such thing as truth, and so instead there is your truth and my truth and his truth and Zer truth. And so all of these different things that you can come up with to make it up for yourself is what it boils down to. And paganism is the same, ultimately, because it's about saying, well, there's so many different gods that you can pick and choose from, and so they're all just as good as the other, and you're going to work with as many of them as you can just in order to get out of them whatever you can for yourself. So it's the same basic idea, and that becomes a meaningless platitude when it runs up against the power that's over the entire universe. Rahab saw the emptiness of her old system of belief with its many false, competing, weak gods, and instead placed her faith in the only God who actually can save. So that was why we saw James and Hebrews hold her up as a role model of faith. And also, in what she does here, she exemplifies the teaching of Jesus from Matthew chapter 10, verse 28. This is much later, but he would eventually say, Do not fear those who kill the body but cannot kill the soul, but rather fear him who is able to destroy both soul and body in hell. Now, when it comes to the Lord, there are eternal ramifications for what we do. Even if somebody can kill us here, this life's coming to an end anyway. But if we're on the hook for the things that we have done against him forever, there's no escaping that. And so, Rahab's fear of human authority didn't blind her to that. It would have been worse to remain God's enemy. It's still worse to remain God's enemy. That hasn't changed. So if you are in a position you're not a Christian, don't allow anything. Don't allow opinion or tradition or culture or fear of any threat to keep you from faith, because none of those things is going to be able to save you in the end. It's only what God offers that can. And if you are a Christian, don't let those things, opinion, tradition, culture, the fear of any threat, don't let them keep you from sharing and living out your faith either, because lives do depend on it. They depended on it for Rahab. The spies, of course, in the first place, but herself, her family. She knew that Israel was going to win regardless, that there was no stopping them because God was on their side. But she requested a recognition of her contribution to what they were going to do, for her and her loved ones to be able to share in the life of God's people, to leave the old life of infidelity behind. And yes, that does refer to the work that she was engaged in, to sexual infidelity, but really I'm talking about spiritual infidelity. That was what they had been before, but they recognized who God was and they were going to follow him now. They were committed to that. She was committed to that. And she asks this of the spies. She asks for this guarantee from them, but she makes them swear it in God's name, because that's a promise that she can trust. And again, it's her saying, he's the one that she is relying on in faith. She recognized that that was what she had to do. And then after doing that, it's time to act. What we see as we move forward now to verse 15. She let them down by a rope through the window, for her house was on the city wall. She dwelt on the wall. And she said to them, "Get to the mountain, lest the pursuers meet you. Hide there 3 days until the pursuers have returned. Afterward you may go your way." So the men said to her, "We will be blameless of this oath of yours which you have made us swear, unless when we come into the land you bind this line of scarlet cord in the window through which you have let us down, and unless you bring your father, your mother, your brothers, and all your father's household to your own home. So it shall be that whoever goes outside the doors of your house into the street, his blood shall be on his own head. We will be guiltless. But whoever is with you in the house, his blood shall be on our head if a hand is laid on him. And if you tell this business of ours, then we will be free from your oath which you made us swear." Then she said, "According to your words, so be it." And she sent them away, and they departed. And she bound the scarlet cord in the window. So the spies had been shut in the city, the gates were closed, and Rahab then, in order to get them away, she lets them down the wall, hangs a rope out the window so that they can climb down and get away, and then she also tells them, "Hey, I don't really trust you guys to know better, so maybe don't go in the direction that they just did in order to hunt you down, go the opposite way." And she sends them into the mountains in order to be able to avoid that pursuit. And so she really has gone above and beyond to prove her commitment. But they tell her one more thing is necessary, and it's something that makes a lot of sense. She has to hang that red cord out of her window, which would have been different from the rope. And the words that are used make it clear that it's something else. And of course, the rope, if she had left that hanging out, the city's defenders would have gotten rid of that, because that would be a way into the city, so they're not going to allow that. It's really more like, you want to think like a scarf or a flag or something like that, something that was visible, that could be seen from the outside, that they'd be able to say when they got back, okay, that's the house, that's the one that we leave alone, everything else is fair game in Jericho. And this is something that's not like made explicit here or anywhere else, but it's at least something that we can notice, is the way that this ties into the idea of the Passover that Israel had experienced themselves, how they had painted their doorposts red, painted them in the blood of the sacrifice, and then stayed inside in order to show their faith, to express their reliance on God's salvation when he came in judgment against Egypt. And so this is very similar to that. Rahab and her family, they hang the red rope where it can be seen and then stay inside. in order to express their faith in deliverance through God during the conquest of Jericho. So it's the same basic idea of having that visible sign of where it was that they were standing and whose side that they were on. And then, of course, we can see how both of those ultimately represent Christ. That it's through faith in him that he's the one God sees when judgment comes, and that he has already accepted it. He already took that punishment upon himself on the cross in the shedding of his blood, and to make it possible so that we could be forgiven, so that we could be rescued. We're protected by being in him, his sacrifice and resurrection. And so that is what we are behind. And then it is supposed to be visible, something that the other people around us can see too, that we should be living to fly the flag of our allegiance so that others also know where this safety can be found. But of course, in talking about the saving of Rahab's family, that is getting a little bit ahead of ourselves, because that's going to be what happens after Jericho is destroyed, and we're not looking at that this week. Instead, we need to turn our attention back to Israel and the preparations for that. And so that's what we find now in Joshua chapter 2 at verse 22. It says that the spies departed and went to the mountain and stayed there 3 days until the pursuers returned. And the pursuers sought them all along the way, but did not find them. So the 2 men returned, descended from the mountain, and crossed over. And they came to Joshua the son of Nun and told him all that had befallen them. And they said to Joshua, "Truly the Lord has delivered all the land into our hands. For indeed all the inhabitants of the country are faint-hearted because of us." So thanks to Rahab, the spies return safely. And then when they get back, they report honestly. And that's noteworthy. It's important, because they're honest in 2 senses. First of all, again, it's that contrast to the earlier spies, the ones who had not only given a bad report when they got back to Moses and the other Israelites, they had actually lied. They had embellished their reports in order to make things seem even worse than they were, in order to try to scare everybody else, because they were too frightened to try to go to war. These 2 spies, they don't do that. They come back and just report exactly what they saw. But on top of that, the other reason where they are honest is in that they tell Joshua what had befallen them, not what they had done. Because all they'd done was get discovered and almost caught. They didn't do a very good job, and they just admitted it. They just said, well, that could have gone better, but it still worked out, because we met this Rahab woman, and she protected us, and from her we heard that Canaan's not ready for us. So they faithfully reported Rahab's assistance, and Joshua saw all of this for what it was. It's really provided by the Lord. He was using all of this to make it clear Israel did not have to be afraid in what they were about to do. And so this follows up from the same things that he had told Joshua in chapter 1. The Canaanites were already defeated, because they were defeated in mind. They may not have converted like Rahab, but they were convulsing in fear. So Israel could go boldly against them. And that movement begins in chapter 3. So the last part of Joshua we're going to look at today, starting at verse 7. The Lord said to Joshua, "This day I will begin to exalt you in the sight of all Israel, that they may know that as I was with Moses, so I will be with you. You shall command the priests who bear the ark of the covenant, saying, when you have come to the edge of the water of the Jordan, you shall stand in the Jordan." So Joshua said to the children of Israel, "Come here and hear the words of the Lord your God." And Joshua said, "By this you shall know that the living God is among you, and that he will without fail drive out from before you the Canaanites and the Hittites, the Hivites and the Perizzites, the Girgashites and the Amorites and the Jebusites. Behold, the ark of the covenant of the Lord of all the earth is crossing over before you into the Jordan. Now therefore, take for yourselves 12 men from the tribes of Israel, 1 man from every tribe. And it shall come to pass, as soon as the soles of the feet of the priests who bear the ark of the Lord of all the earth, shall rest in the waters of the Jordan, that the waters of the Jordan shall be cut off, the waters that come down from upstream, and they shall stand as a heap." So it was, when the people set out from their camp to cross over the Jordan, with the priests bearing the ark of the covenant before the people, and as those who bore the ark came to the Jordan, and the feet of the priests who bore the ark dipped into the edge of the water, for the Jordan overflows all its banks during the whole time of harvest, that the waters which came down from upstream stood still, and rose in a heap very far away at Adam, the city that is beside Zeraton. So the waters that went down into the Sea of the Arabah, the Salt Sea, failed and were cut off, and the people crossed over opposite Jericho. Then the priests who bore the ark of the covenant of the Lord stood firm on dry ground in the midst of the Jordan. And all Israel crossed over on dry ground until all the people had crossed completely over the Jordan. So in chapter 1, God spoke to Joshua in order to encourage him. In chapter 2, he uses the situation in Jericho with Rahab to show him Canaan's fear. This is one more shot in the arm. This miracle is about him following in Moses' footsteps, doing something that Moses had done in order to strengthen Israel's submission to him, to Joshua, as their leader, that he's the one that they're going to follow in this. But of course, always to be borne in mind, it's really about God's leadership. He's the one who's actually doing this, so that they will all be more and more submitted to him. And this miracle's meaning is pretty obvious. Just as God had let Israel out of Egypt, now he is letting them into Canaan. The Lord is with them, so they do not have to be afraid. Jericho does. Remember, Rahab had listed the crossing of the Red Sea first in her reasons for Canaanite terror. And not only the type of miracle that it was, it also has to be borne in mind that that was how God had destroyed the Egyptian army as they tried to follow behind. They heard about it. Now Jericho gets to see that for themselves right out their front door. They are powerless to stop what is coming. But for Israel, on the other hand, this is a moment of joy because the time has come. Crossing through water on dry land was how they entered the wilderness. Now it's how they leave it. The decades of wandering and loss are over. They are in the promised land. It's time to take it. But there's one more thing that I want to note for today because of how important it is for us. It's part of an even greater miracle that's fulfilled an even greater promise. And it's that, again, Rahab and her family, they were going to be spared and welcomed into Israel. And that comes up in Matthew chapter 1, verses 1 to 6. It says, the book of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham. Abraham begot Isaac, Isaac begot Jacob, and Jacob begot Judah and his brothers. Judah begot Perez and Zerah by Tamar. Perez begot Hezron, and Hezron begot Ram. Ram begot Amminadab. Amminadab begot Nahshon, and Nahshon begot Salmon. Salmon begot Boaz by Rahab. Boaz begot Obed by Ruth. Obed begot Jesse, and Jesse begot David the king. When we come across these genealogies in Scripture, it can be very tough to get through because they're just long lists of names, and the names are often very unfamiliar, and so eyes just kind of gloss over, ears aren't really listening anymore. But they are important, and this is an especially good example of why that's the case. Because one of the people mentioned in this genealogy was Rahab. That this Canaanite and prostitute became part of the tribe of Judah and eventually became the mother of kings. And, more important than anyone else, one of her descendants was the Son of God born into human flesh. That this was what was accomplished with her. God was gracious to forgive her and include her in his marvelous plan of salvation. Because that's what he does. That inclusion is still available to all those who have faith like her. And so if you're not a believer, then I hope that you can see yourself in her situation and then make the choice that she did. Because ultimately there are only two choices that can be made. All of the Canaanites were afraid. They were right to be. But most of them defied God anyway. And that got them nowhere. There was no way out of what they were up against. Just as there is no way out of what we are up against. We all face mortality eventually. We should be concerned by it. It cannot be ignored forever. So the choice is, will you accept the only available way of escape, or will you just wait for your assured destruction? Because there is not an alternative to this. And I hope that you will not leave yourself exposed, that you will instead accept Christ's covering, what he has made available through his death and resurrection, to pay the price, to welcome you in where nothing else can. As I hope you make that decision to be saved. And if you are saved, and that's already what you have done, then the thing I would invite you to do is not forget that God welcomes people like Rahab for whatever she had done and whatever we make of prostitution, lying, treason in this particular case. She was not perfect. None of us is better. We don't have anyone that we can look down on. What would have happened to you if somebody had done that to you? Where would you be without being told the truth of what Christ has done? So that's what we need to do. Go out. Let them see the promise of rescue that's available to them and welcome them to join us in the life to which Christ is bringing us over.